The desert stretched before them like a vast ocean of sand, rippling under the pale moonlight. In the distance, the horizon flickered with the orange glow of burning oil wells, columns of black smoke spiraling upward into the night sky. Captain James Thunder Harrington squinted through the vision blocks of his M1A1 Abrams tank, his weathered face illuminated by the soft green glow of the instrument panel. The radio crackled with static before the voice of his commanding officer cut through. Thunder 6, this is Warhorse Actual. You are cleared to proceed. I repeat, you are cleared to proceed. Over. Harrington pressed the transmit button on his comm. Roger that, Warhorse. Thunder 6 moving out. He glanced at his crew. Sergeant Peterson, his gunner, was hunched over the gun sight, his fingers tapping nervously against the firing controls. Corporal Rodriguez, the loader, had just slammed a fresh round into the breech, the metallic clang reverberating through the cramped interior of the tank. Private First Class Mitchell, barely 21 years old, sat at the driver's station, his hands gripping the control sticks with white knuckles. All right, gentlemen, Harrington said, his voice steady and controlled. Let's remember our training, Mitchell. Keep us moving at a steady pace. Peterson, I want you scanning for targets continuously. Rodriguez, keep those rounds coming. Today we make history. It was February 26, 1991. Operation Desert Storm was entering its final phase, and Harrington's platoon of 4 M1A1 Abrams tanks was at the spearhead of what would become the largest tank battle since World War II. Intelligence had reported a concentration of Iraqi T-72 tanks dug into defensive positions just beyond the next ridge. The mission was clear: break through the Iraqi lines and secure the highway to Kuwait City. As the small formation of American tanks crested the ridge, the battlefield revealed itself before them. 27 Iraqi T-72 tanks were positioned in a semicircle, their gun barrels trained on the approaching Americans. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Harrington felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the clarity of thought that always came to him in the moments before combat. "Contact front!" Peterson shouted, his voice sharp with adrenaline. "Identified," Harrington responded, his calm a counterpoint to the mounting tension. "Multiple T-72s, 11 o'clock, range 2,000 meters. Mitchell, halt. Peterson, target lead tank, sabot round." The Abrams shuddered to a stop, its turbine engine idling with a high-pitched whine. Peterson adjusted his sight, centering the crosshairs on the lead Iraqi tank. "Target acquired. Fire." The tank rocked backward as the 120-number main gun erupted, sending a depleted uranium penetrator downrange at over a mile per second. Through his sight, Harrington watched as the round struck the Iraqi tank square in the turret. A brilliant flash, followed by a secondary explosion as the ammunition inside cooked off. The T-72's turret lifted into the air, spinning like a grotesque top before crashing back to Earth. "Target destroyed," Peterson announced, already shifting to the next threat. The battle was joined. Across the line, the other Abrams tanks opened fire, their main guns punching through the night with thunderous reports. The Iraqi tanks returned fire, their rounds falling short or glancing harmlessly off the sloped armor of the American tanks. "Driver, advance," Harrington ordered. "Gunner, continue engaging targets of opportunity." The Abrams lurched forward, its tracks churning through the sand. Peterson worked methodically, engaging and destroying one Iraqi tank after another. Rodriguez loaded round after round, his movements precise and efficient. Mitchell maneuvered the 60-ton behemoth with surprising agility, using the natural contours of the terrain for cover. Within minutes, the battlefield was transformed. Burning Iraqi tanks dotted the landscape, their ammunition cooking off in spectacular pyrotechnic displays. Black smoke billowed into the night sky, obscuring the stars. Through his thermal sight, Harrington could see Iraqi crewmen abandoning their vehicles, fleeing into the desert. "Cease fire," he ordered, surveying the carnage. "Cease fire and scan for new threats." The radio crackled with the reports from the other tanks in his platoon. No casualties. 14 Iraqi tanks confirmed destroyed. The remainder were retreating northward, away from the advancing American forces. It should have been a moment of triumph. The battle was over almost before it had begun, a testament to American technology, training, and tactics. But as Harrington watched the burning wrecks of the Iraqi tanks, he felt no elation, only a profound weariness. "Thunder 6, this is Thunder 2, came the voice of Lieutenant Garcia from the second tank in the formation. "We've got movement at our 3 o'clock. Looks like a survivor trying to exit a disabled T-72. Harrington swiveled his sight to the indicated position. Through the thermal imager, he could see a human figure struggling to emerge from the hatch of a tank that had taken a hit to the engine compartment. The vehicle wasn't burning yet, but it was only a matter of time. "Roger, Thunder 2, I see him," Harrington replied. "Hold position and continue to scan for threats." Standard operating procedure was clear. Do not engage with enemy combatants unless they posed an immediate threat. The Iraqi tanker was likely injured, possibly dying. Extraction teams would follow behind the advance, dealing with prisoners and casualties. But something made Harrington hesitate. Perhaps it was the way the man moved, desperate but dignified. Perhaps it was the knowledge that in a few minutes, that tank might become an inferno, trapping anyone inside. Or perhaps it was simply the recognition, soul deep, that beneath the uniforms and the flags, they were all men caught in the machinery of war. "Mitchell, bring us around. Rodriguez, man the 50. Peterson, keep scanning for threats." His crew exchanged glances, but said nothing. They had served with Harrington long enough to trust his judgment, even when his orders deviated from protocol. The Abrams swung around, its tracks kicking up plumes of sand as it approached the disabled Iraqi tank. Through his sight, Harrington could now see that the man was an officer, judging by his uniform. He was trying to pull another crewman from the hatch, but appeared to be injured himself. "Thunder 6, this is Warhorse Actual," the radio crackled. "Be advised you are breaking formation. Return to your position immediately. Extraction teams will handle enemy casualties. Over." Harrington hesitated, his hand hovering over the transmit button. "Sir," Mitchell said from the driver's seat, "that tank could blow any minute." The decision crystallized in Harrington's mind. "Thunder 6 acknowledges," he responded to his commanding officer. "Investigating possible intelligence opportunity. Will rejoin formation shortly. Out." He switched to the internal comm. "Mitchell, bring us within 20 meters, then halt. I'm going out." "Sir?" Rodriguez questioned, his voice tinged with disbelief. "You heard me, Corporal. Keep that 50 trained on the Iraqi, but do not fire unless I give the order or they make a hostile move." Harrington unstrapped himself from the commander's seat and reached for his sidearm, checking that it was loaded before holstering it. He grabbed a medical kit from its storage compartment, then pushed open the commander's hatch. The hot desert air hit him like a physical force after the climate-controlled interior of the tank. He climbed down the side of the Abrams, his boots finding purchase on the metal handholds. As his feet touched the sand, he was struck by the surreal quiet of the battlefield. The thunder of guns had been replaced by the crackle of burning vehicles and the distant rumble of advancing American forces. The Iraqi officer had spotted him now and had frozen in place, one hand still trying to support his injured comrade, the other reaching instinctively for a sidearm that wasn't there. Harrington raised his hands, palms open. "I'm here to help," he said, knowing the Iraqi probably didn't understand English, but hoping his tone and gestures would convey his intentions. He approached slowly, medical kit held visibly in one hand. The Iraqi officer watched him with a mixture of suspicion and desperation. As Harrington drew closer, he could see that both men were seriously injured. The officer had a deep shrapnel wound in his side, while his comrade appeared to have suffered severe burns to his face and hands. Harrington pointed to the medical kit, then to the injured men, trying to communicate his intent. The Iraqi officer hesitated, then nodded once, a brief acknowledgement of the temporary truce between them. Working quickly, Harrington applied field dressings to the worst of their wounds. The burned man was unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular. The officer watched Harrington work with wary eyes, occasionally glancing at the American tank looming behind them. "We need to move him," Harrington said, gesturing to the injured crewman and then to the Iraqi tank, which was beginning to emit ominous popping sounds as ammunition cooked off in the heat. "Tank, boom. Understand?" The Iraqi officer nodded, his eyes showing that he comprehended the danger. Together, they lifted the unconscious man and moved him a safe distance from the vehicle. No sooner had they reached what Harrington judged to be a safe distance than the T-72's ammunition detonated, sending a fireball into the night sky. The Iraqi officer watched his tank burn, his face a mask of stoic resignation. Then, to Harrington's surprise, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper and what appeared to be a military badge. He pressed both into Harrington's hand, speaking rapidly in Arabic, his eyes intense with urgency. Harrington couldn't understand the words, but the gesture was clear enough. This was something important to the Iraqi, something he wanted preserved. Harrington nodded and tucked both items into his vest pocket. Thunder 6, this is Warhorse Actual, his radio squawked. Extraction Team ETA 3 minutes to your position. Return to formation immediately. That is a direct order. Over. Harrington keyed his radio. Roger, Warhorse. Moving to rejoin now. 2 Iraqi casualties secured. Request medical assistance. Over. Negative, Thunder 6. Extraction team will handle. Return to formation. Over. Harrington looked at the Iraqi officer who seemed to understand that their brief moment of humanity amid the chaos of war was ending. The officer straightened, wincing at the pain from his wounds, and offered a formal salute. Harrington returned the salute, a gesture of respect between warriors, then turned and walked back to his tank. As he climbed aboard, he could hear the approaching helicopters of the extraction team. "Let's move out," he ordered as he settled back into his commander's seat. "Rejoin the formation." As the Abrams rumbled away, Harrington glanced back one last time at the Iraqi officer, standing sentinel over his injured comrade amid the burning wreckage of battle. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that transcended the artificial boundaries of nationality and conflict. Little did he know that this brief encounter would echo across 3 decades, binding their fates together in ways he could never have imagined. The years after Desert Storm passed in a blur of deployments, promotions, and eventually retirement. Harrington left the Army as a colonel in 2011 after a distinguished career that included combat tours in Iraq, Afghanistan, and various peacekeeping missions around the globe. Civilian life proved more challenging than he had anticipated. His wife, Margaret, had stood by him through 20 years of military service, raising their son Justin largely on her own during Harrington's frequent absences. But the man who returned from his final deployment was not the same man she had married. The accumulated weight of combat experiences, the lives taken and the lives lost, had changed him in ways that neither of them fully understood. They tried, for a time, to build a life together in a modest house near Fort Benning. Harrington took a job as a defense consultant, leveraging his expertise in armored warfare. But the work felt hollow, divorced from the visceral reality of command. The marriage, already strained by years of separation, couldn't withstand the pressures of daily proximity. They divorced in 2013, the paperwork as clinical and impersonal as a military operation. Justin had followed in his father's footsteps, commissioning as an Army officer after graduating from West Point. Harrington had felt a complex mixture of pride and apprehension as he pinned second lieutenant bars on his son's shoulders. Pride in Justin's accomplishments, apprehension at sending another generation into harm's way. His fears proved prophetic. In 2015, Major Justin Harrington was killed when his vehicle struck an IED outside Kandahar, Afghanistan. The notification came on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered by a solemn-faced casualty assistance officer and a chaplain. Harrington received the news with the stoicism ingrained by decades of military service, thanking the officers for their time, closing the door, and then methodically destroying every piece of furniture in his living room. The funeral was a blur of flags, rifle volleys, and solemn-faced soldiers. Margaret was there, their shared grief briefly bridging the gulf between them. But when the last note of taps faded into the summer air, they went their separate ways once more, each to bear their loss alone. Grief, Harrington discovered, was not a linear journey but a labyrinth, with unexpected turns and dead ends. He moved to a small apartment near the Patton Museum of Cavalry and Armor at Fort Knox, Kentucky, seeking some connection to the world he had left behind. The museum became his sanctuary, a place where the machines of war were preserved not as instruments of destruction, but as artifacts of human ingenuity and courage. It was there, among the tanks and armored vehicles of American military history, that Harrington began to find some measure of peace. He volunteered as a guide, sharing his knowledge with visitors, particularly veterans and their families. The museum director, recognizing the authenticity that Harrington brought to the role, eventually offered him a part-time position. And so, at 72 years old, James Thunder Harrington found himself once again surrounded by tanks, though these were silent sentinels rather than the roaring beasts of his combat days. He lived simply, his military pension and modest salary from the museum covering his basic needs. His apartment walls were decorated with photographs and memorabilia from his service years, including one particularly treasured item, a shadow box containing his combat decorations, a piece of Iraqi tank armor, and a carefully preserved military badge from an unknown Iraqi officer. The paper that had accompanied the badge remained in Harrington's possession as well, the Arabic script as indecipherable to him now as it had been 30 years ago. He had made attempts over the years to have it translated, but somehow the timing never seemed right, or the translator wasn't available, or some other obstacle presented itself. Perhaps, on some level, he preferred the mystery, the connection to a moment of humanity amid the destruction of war. Margaret had succumbed to cancer in 2018, her final days spent in a hospice facility with Harrington at her bedside. Despite their estrangement, he had never stopped caring for her, never stopped feeling responsible for her well-being. Her death severed one of his last connections to life before the war, before the losses that had defined his later years. Now, on a crisp autumn morning in 2021, Harrington stood in the main exhibition hall of the Patton Museum, watching as a school group filed past the M1A1 Abrams tank that dominated the center of the space. Not his tank specifically, but the same model, restored to display condition. This tank, he explained to the attentive students, was the primary battle tank of the United States Army during Operation Desert Storm. With a top speed of 45 miles per hour, a 120-millimeter main gun, and composite armor, it outclassed anything in the Iraqi arsenal. But a tank is only as good as its crew, and the American tankers of Desert Storm were the finest in the world. He ran his hand along the sloped armor of the turret, feeling the smooth metal beneath his palm. After all these years, he could still recall the sensation of commanding such a machine, the way it responded to his orders, the confidence it instilled in his men. The four-person crew consisted of a commander, a gunner, a loader, and a driver. Each had specific duties, but they functioned as a single unit, a team whose effectiveness depended on trust and communication. In combat, these men weren't just operating a weapon system, they were protecting each other. A boy at the front of the group raised his hand. "Did you ever kill anyone with it?" The question, innocent in its directness, caused a momentary hush among the chaperones. But Harrington had heard it before, had developed an answer that acknowledged the reality without glorifying the violence. In war, soldiers sometimes have to take actions that would be unthinkable in peacetime, he said, meeting the boy's gaze. "I served my country, followed my orders, and did what was necessary to protect my crew and accomplish our mission. But the true measure of a soldier isn't how many lives he takes, but how many he saves." The boy nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer, and the group moved on to the next exhibit. Harrington remained by the Abrams for a moment longer, his reflection ghostly in its polished surface. Later that afternoon, as Harrington was cataloging a new acquisition for the museum's collection, the director, Dr. Eleanor Chen, appeared in the doorway of the small room he used as an office. Her expression was grave. "James, do you have a moment? We need to talk." He gestured to the chair across from his desk, noting the tension in her posture as she sat down. "What's on your mind, Eleanor?" She placed a folder on the desk between them. "I just got out of a conference call with representatives from the Pentagon's budget office and the Department of Defense Museum Division. It's not good news." Harrington opened this folder, scanning the documents inside. Budget projections, visitor statistics, maintenance costs. The picture they painted was bleak. "They're cutting our funding," he said, a statement rather than a question. Chen nodded. "By 60% effective next fiscal quarter. They're calling it strategic reallocation of cultural heritage resources. What it means is that unless we can secure alternative funding, we'll have to close most of the exhibits and cut the staff by at least half." Harrington leaned back in his chair, absorbing the impact of her words. The Patton Museum wasn't just his workplace, it was his connection to a past that was increasingly fading from public memory, a repository of lessons learned through blood and sacrifice. "What about the restoration projects, the educational programs?" "All on the chopping block," Chen replied, the frustration evident in her voice. "The Pentagon is sending an assessment team next month to evaluate which parts of the collection are essential to the Army's historical narrative. Everything else will be mothballed or transferred to other institutions." "Who's leading this assessment team?" Chen consulted her notes. "A Lieutenant Colonel Adam Khalid from the Pentagon's Historical Review Division. The email says he's a military historian with expertise in armored warfare." Harrington frowned. The name was unfamiliar, but something about the situation struck him as wrong. The Patton Museum wasn't just a collection of old machines. It was a living testament to the evolution of American armored warfare, a place where veterans could reconnect with their service and where civilians could gain some understanding of the realities of combat. "This isn't right, Eleanor. These artifacts, these exhibits, They tell a story that can't be quantified in budget spreadsheets. They're about courage, sacrifice, innovation. They're about people. Chen's expression softened. I know, James. That's why I wanted to talk to you first. If anyone can make the case for the museum's value, it's you. You bring these exhibits to life for our visitors. Your experiences, your insights, they're irreplaceable. Harrington stood, moving to the window that overlooked the museum grounds. Outside, a family was taking photographs beside a Sherman tank, the father pointing out features to his children with animated gestures. When is this Lieutenant Colonel Khalid arriving? 4 weeks from today. He'll be here for 3 days, conducting his assessment. Harrington turned back to face Chen, his decision already made. Then we have 4 weeks to prepare our case. I want full access to the museum's financial records, visitor statistics, educational impact assessments, everything. If the Pentagon wants data, we'll give them data. But we'll also give them something their spreadsheets can't capture: the human element. Chen's eyes widened slightly at his intensity. What are you planning, James? A campaign, he replied, a hint of his old command presence returning to his voice. Operation Steel Legacy. We're going to mobilize every veteran, every military family, every supporter we can reach. By the time Khalid arrives, he'll understand exactly what's at stake here. For the first time since entering his office, Chen smiled. I was hoping you'd say something like that. The staff is already on board. We've started reaching out to local veterans organizations and community leaders. Harrington nodded approvingly. Good, but we need to think bigger. I still have contacts at the Tank and Armored Fighting Vehicle Association, the Armor and Cavalry Heritage Foundation. Let's get them involved, and media coverage, we need that too. I'll handle the administrative side, Chen said, standing. You focus on the strategy. After she left, Harrington remained at the window, watching the family outside as they moved on to examine a Patton tank. His mind was already formulating plans, identifying resources, assessing potential allies and obstacles. It was a familiar mental process, one honed through decades of military planning. But this wouldn't be like commanding a tank platoon or even an armored battalion. This was a different kind of battle, one fought not with cannons and armor, but with words and influence. The stakes weren't measured in territory gained or enemy combatants neutralized, but in memories preserved and lessons transmitted to future generations. Harrington returned to his desk and began making notes, starting with a list of contacts to call. The work energized him in a way he hadn't felt in years, giving purpose to days that had increasingly been defined by routine and remembrance. Over the next week, Harrington threw himself into organizing what was rapidly evolving from a defensive action into a full-fledged campaign. He established a command center of sorts in one of the museum's education rooms, walls covered with charts, timelines, and lists of potential allies. Veterans began to arrive, drawn by Harrington's reputation and the urgent nature of the cause. They came from different eras, different branches of service, but united by a common understanding of what the museum represented. Walter Doc Thompson, 78 years old, had served as a combat medic with the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment in Vietnam. His hands, once steady enough to perform field surgery amid the chaos of battle, now shook slightly with age. But his mind remained sharp, his commitment unwavering. These young Pentagon bureaucrats, he grumbled during one planning session, they think history is just dates and statistics. They've never smelled diesel and gunpowder, never felt the ground shake beneath 60 tons of rolling thunder. Maria Gonzalez, 65, nodded in agreement. As one of the first female maintenance technicians trained on the M1 Abrams, she had broken barriers in a male-dominated field, earning respect through competence and determination. The machines are important, she added, but they're just metal and wires without the people who operated them, maintained them, lived and died in them. That's what this museum preserves, the human story behind the technology. Richard "Rick" Chen, 60, had served as a gunner with the 1st Armored Division during Desert Storm. Now a high school physics teacher, he understood the educational value of the museum better than most. I bring my students here every year, he said. You can explain Newton's laws of motion in a classroom, but when they see how those principles apply to a 50-ton vehicle moving across the battlefield, suddenly physics isn't abstract anymore. It's real, it's relevant. Marcus Johnson, 68, had been a tank driver, setting a division record for cross-country movement during training exercises that stood to this day. Now he applied his logistical skills to organizing the growing number of volunteers. We need to be strategic about this, he advised. Concentrate our forces where they'll have the most impact. Media coverage, congressional outreach, public demonstrations, all coordinated for maximum effect. Together, they formed what Harrington jokingly referred to as his Old Steel Brigade, a core group of veterans who understood the stakes and possessed the skills and connections to make a difference. Each brought their own network of contacts, expanding the campaign's reach exponentially. Chen, meanwhile, marshaled the museum staff, coordinating with the volunteers while continuing the day-to-day operations. She proved to be a skilled administrator, anticipating needs and solving problems before they became critical. The campaign began to take shape. Veterans organized a letter-writing drive targeting key members of congressional defense committees. Museum staff developed a comprehensive proposal for alternative funding sources, including corporate sponsorships and expanded educational partnerships. Local media ran features on the museum's importance to the community and its educational value. Harrington found himself in a familiar role, that of the commander coordinating diverse elements toward a common objective. The tactics were different, but the principles remained the same: clear communication, efficient use of resources, adaptability in the face of changing circumstances. 2 weeks into the campaign, as Harrington was reviewing the latest media coverage in his makeshift office, a young museum intern appeared at the door. "Mr. Harrington, there's someone here to see you. Says he's from the Pentagon." Harrington frowned. The assessment team wasn't due for another 2 weeks. Did he give a name? Lieutenant Colonel Adam Khalid. The name triggered a surge of adrenaline, the body's ancient response to potential threat. Harrington composed himself, straightening his posture and adjusting his shirt. "Show him in, please." Moments later, a man in his mid-30s entered the room. He wore civilian clothes, a tailored suit that spoke of careful attention to appearance, but his bearing was unmistakably military. Dark hair cut to regulation length, posture precise without being rigid, movements economical and controlled. His features suggested Middle Eastern heritage, with intense dark eyes that missed nothing as they scanned the room. "Colonel Harrington," he said, extending his hand. "Lieutenant Colonel Adam Khalid. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Harrington stood to shake the offered hand, noting the firm grip, the direct gaze. "It's just Mr. these days, Lieutenant Colonel. I've been retired for a decade now, and everything about this museum is important, at least to those of us who understand its value." If Khalid registered the subtle challenge in Harrington's words, he gave no sign. "Of course, that's precisely why I'm here ahead of schedule. I wanted to get a sense of the place before the formal assessment begins." Harrington gestured to a chair. "Please sit down. I'm curious about something, Lieutenant Colonel. How does a historical review officer end up deciding the fate of one of the Army's most significant museums?" Khalid settled into the chair, his posture remaining formal. "Budget realities, Mr. Harrington. The Pentagon faces difficult choices in allocating limited resources. My team's role is to ensure that those choices are informed by a comprehensive understanding of the historical and educational value of facilities like this one." "And your background in armored warfare?" Dr. Chen mentioned you had expertise in the field. A flicker of something, perhaps approval at Harrington's homework, crossed Khalid's face. "My doctoral dissertation was on the evolution of American armored doctrine from World War II through Desert Storm. I've published several papers on the subject in military journals." "Academic knowledge," Harrington noted, "it is valuable, but have you ever commanded a tank in combat, Lieutenant Colonel? Felt the recoil of the main gun, smelled the cordite, made split-second decisions with lives hanging in the balance?" Khalid's expression cooled slightly. "I served 2 tours in Iraq with the 1st Cavalry Division, Mr. Harrington. Not in tanks, but as an intelligence officer. I've seen combat, if that's what you're asking." Harrington nodded, acknowledging the correction. "My apologies for the assumption. It's just that those of us who've lived the history this museum preserves tend to be passionate about its continuation." "Passion is admirable," Khalid replied, his tone measured. "But the Pentagon's decisions must be based on objective criteria: historical significance, educational impact, visitor engagement, maintenance costs, all weighed against competing priorities for limited defense dollars." As Khalid spoke, Harrington's attention was drawn to something the younger officer was wearing, partially visible beneath his suit jacket. A military badge of some kind, not standard U.S. issue, pinned to his belt or perhaps a lanyard. The sight triggered a memory, hazy with the passage of time but suddenly relevant. The Iraqi officer in the desert pressing a badge into his hand along with a folded paper. The items that had resided in Harrington's shadow box for 30 years, mementos of a brief connection amid the chaos of war. That badge, Harrington said, interrupting whatever Khalid had been saying about budget allocations. May I ask where you got it? Khalid's hand moved automatically to the item, his fingers brushing it with what seemed like an unconscious gesture of reassurance or protection. It belonged to my father. He was an officer in the Iraqi Republican Guard during the Gulf War. The revelation hung in the air between them, charged with implications. Harrington felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with his age or health. Your father, he said carefully, served in the Republican Guard during Desert Storm. Khalid's expression remained composed, but there was a new wariness in his eyes. Yes, he commanded a T-72 battalion. He was wounded and captured by American forces during the ground offensive. Harrington's mind raced, calculating probabilities, connections, the strange workings of fate across decades. What was his name? Karim al-Rashid, Khalid replied. After the war, he emigrated to the United States, brought me with him. I was 7 years old at the time. He became a U.S. citizen, worked as an engineering consultant. He died in 2010, heart attack. Harrington leaned back in his chair, the weight of coincidence, if it was coincidence, momentarily overwhelming. Could it be possible? Out of thousands of Iraqi officers, what were the chances that this man, now sitting across from him and holding power over the museum's fate, was connected to that moment in the desert 30 years ago? Lieutenant Colonel, he said, his voice steady despite the tumult of his thoughts. I think there may be more to discuss than museum budgets, but perhaps that conversation should wait until your official assessment begins. Khalid studied him with those intense dark eyes, clearly sensing that something significant had shifted in their interaction but unable to identify its nature. As you wish, Mr. Harrington. I'll return with my team as scheduled. In the meantime, I recommend you continue your preparations. The Pentagon's fiscal constraints are very real, regardless of the historical value of this institution. He stood, straightening his jacket. For what it's worth, I respect what you and your colleagues are trying to accomplish here, but sentiment alone won't save this museum. Harrington rose as well, military courtesy ingrained too deeply to remain seated when a fellow officer, even one from a different era, was departing. It's not about sentiment, Lieutenant Colonel. It's about understanding that history isn't just preserved in books and databases. Sometimes it needs to be tangible, something you can see and touch and feel, something that connects one generation of warriors to the next. Khalid nodded, a gesture that acknowledged Harrington's words without necessarily agreeing with them. Good day, Mr. Harrington. I'll see you in 2 weeks. After Khalid had gone, Harrington sat alone in the quiet of his office, contemplating the strange turns that life sometimes took. If his suspicions were correct, if Adam Khalid was indeed the son of the Iraqi officer he had encountered in the desert, what did it mean for the museum? For the campaign they were building? For the memories he had carried for 3 decades? He reached for his phone, dialing a number he knew by heart. Doc, he said when Thompson answered, I need you to gather the Old Steel Brigade. Something's come up, something that might change everything. As he spoke, Harrington's gaze fell on a photograph on his desk, taken during Desert Storm. He stood beside his Abrams tank, surrounded by his crew, all of them young and unaware of how that conflict would echo through their lives for decades to come. Beyond them, the desert stretched to the horizon, impassive and eternal, witness to the brief, fierce struggles of men and machines. In that moment, James Thunder Harrington understood that the campaign to save the Patton Museum had become something more than a fight for funding or facilities. It had become a reckoning with his own past, a chance to understand the true impact of actions taken in the heat of battle, and perhaps, in some small way, to complete a circle that had begun in the burning sands of Iraq 30 years before. The Old Steel Brigade gathered in the small conference room adjacent to the main exhibition hall, their faces grave as Harrington recounted his meeting with Lieutenant Colonel Khalid. Outside the windows, twilight was settling over the museum grounds, casting long shadows across the silent ranks of tanks and armored vehicles on display. Let me get this straight, Doc Thompson said, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had long since gone cold. The Pentagon sends an officer to determine if our museum stays open or gets gutted, and by some cosmic coincidence, he happens to be the son of an Iraqi tank commander you encountered during Desert Storm? Harrington nodded, pacing the length of the conference table. It seems that way. The badge Khalid was wearing, it matched the one given to me by an Iraqi officer 30 years ago. And the timeline fits his father's story, a Republican Guard tank commander captured during the ground offensive. Maria Gonzalez leaned forward, her analytical mind already processing the implications. What are the odds? Thousands of Iraqi officers, millions of Americans, and somehow this connection surfaces now, when the museum's future is on the line. Some might call it fate, Rick Chen offered. Others might call it suspicious. Marcus Johnson, ever the pragmatist, brought them back to practical considerations. The question is, how does this affect our campaign? Does this connection give us leverage, or does it complicate things? Harrington stopped pacing, resting his hands on the back of an empty chair. I don't know yet. Khalid gave no indication that he recognized my name or knew anything about my connection to his father. It's possible he doesn't know the details of his father's capture. Or he knows exactly who you are and is playing his cards close to the vest, Thompson countered. Military intelligence officer, right? They're trained to reveal only what serves their purpose. The room fell silent as each veteran considered the implications. The campaign to save the museum had already been complex, a battle fought with public opinion and political influence rather than shells and armor. This unexpected personal connection added a dimension that none of them had anticipated. What about the note? Gonzalez asked suddenly. You said the Iraqi officer gave you a piece of paper with Arabic writing. Have you ever had it translated? Harrington shook his head. I tried a few times over the years, but it never seemed urgent. The timing was never right or the translator wasn't available. Maybe subconsciously I preferred the mystery. Well, it's urgent now, Johnson said decisively. We need to know what that paper says before Khalid returns with his assessment team. It might give us insight into his perspective, maybe even a way to reach him. Harrington nodded, the logic undeniable. I'll retrieve it tonight. Chen, do we have any contacts who can translate Arabic on short notice? The museum director consulted her phone. Dr. Mahmoud at the university has helped us with Arabic inscriptions on artifacts before. I can reach out to him first thing tomorrow. Good, Harrington said, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. In the meantime, we continue with the campaign as planned. Media outreach, congressional contacts, community engagement, all proceeding at full speed. We can't assume that this personal connection will change anything about the Pentagon's decision-making process. As the meeting broke up, Thompson lingered behind, waiting until they were alone before addressing Harrington. Jim, he said, using the informal address that only a few were permitted, there's something else to consider here. If Khalid is indeed the son of the officer you encountered, his perspective on this museum, on American military history, might be more complex than we're accounting for. Harrington raised an eyebrow. You think his father's experience as an enemy combatant might prejudice him against us? Thompson shrugged. Or the opposite. His father survived the war, emigrated to the United States, became a citizen. That suggests he found something here worth embracing, despite having fought against American forces. And his son chose to serve in the same military that defeated his father. That's a powerful statement. The observation gave Harrington pause. He had been viewing Khalid primarily as an obstacle, a Pentagon bureaucrat with the power to end something he valued deeply. But Thompson was right. The man's background suggested a more nuanced relationship with American military history. I need to understand his perspective better, Harrington concluded. Before his assessment team arrives, I want to know what drives Lieutenant Colonel Adam Khalid. The next morning, Harrington drove to his apartment and retrieved the shadow box containing his Desert Storm memorabilia. He carefully removed the framed display from the wall, opened the back, and extracted the folded paper and military badge that had been preserved there for 3 decades. The paper was yellowed with age, the creases deeply set from years of being folded. The writing in flowing Arabic script remained as incomprehensible to him as it had been on that day in the desert. The badge, a metal insignia with Arabic characters and military symbols, was tarnished but still intact. He placed both items in a protective envelope and returned to the museum where Chen had arranged for Dr. Mahmoud to meet them during his lunch break from university classes. The professor, a dignified man in his 60s with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses, examined the items with scholarly interest, turning the paper carefully in his hands and studying the badge with a small magnifying glass. The badge is a unit insignia from the Iraqi Republican Guard, specifically the Medina Division, he explained. It would have been worn by a senior officer, possibly a battalion or regimental commander. He then turned his attention to the paper, reading the Arabic text silently, his expression growing more serious as he progressed. This is personal correspondence, he said finally, looking up at Harrington. a message of some significance to the writer. Are you sure you want me to translate it? It seems quite private. Harrington nodded, the weight of 30 years hanging on this moment. Please, doctor. It may be important to understanding a current situation. Dr. Mahmoud adjusted his glasses and began to translate. It says, "To the American officer who showed mercy when none was expected. If you are reading this, then I did not survive to express my gratitude in person. My son, Adam, lives in America with his mother's family in Michigan. If your honor permits, tell him that his father died with dignity, fighting for what he believed in, even if the cause was unworthy. Tell him that true courage is found not in blind obedience, but in the choices we make when confronted with the humanity of our enemies. May Allah guide you both to wisdom and peace." Silence fell in the room as the translation concluded. Harrington sat motionless, the words resonating through him like the echo of a distant shell impact. After all these years, the voice of the Iraqi officer reached across time, no longer a nameless enemy, but a man with fears, hopes, and a son he would never see grow to adulthood. "Thank you, Doctor," Harrington said finally, his voice rougher than usual. "This is exactly what I needed to know." After Dr. Mahmoud had departed, Chen turned to Harrington with a question in her eyes. "James, what does this mean for our situation with Lieutenant Colonel Khalid?" Harrington carefully refolded the paper. "It means that Khalid doesn't know the whole story of his father's capture. Al-Rashid wrote this assuming he wouldn't survive. But he did, at least long enough to emigrate to the United States with his son. He never delivered this message because he didn't need to. But now his son is here, about to determine the fate of our museum," Chen observed. "Do you tell him about this connection? Show him the note." It was a question Harrington had been pondering since the translation. The note represented a private moment, a man facing what he believed might be his final hours, entrusting a message to a stranger. There was something sacred in that exchange, something that deserved respect. Not yet, he decided. First, I need to understand Khalid better, gauge his perspective on the museum, on military history, on his father's service. The note might influence his assessment in ways we can't predict. I won't use a dying man's words as leverage unless absolutely necessary. Chen accepted his decision without further comment. They had more immediate concerns, as the campaign to save the museum was entering a critical phase. The local media coverage had gained traction, with several national outlets picking up the story. Veterans groups from across the country had begun sending letters and making calls to key congressional offices. The museum's social media presence had expanded dramatically, with first-hand accounts from visitors about the impact the facility had on their understanding of military history. Harrington threw himself into the work, coordinating the various elements of the campaign while maintaining his regular duties as a museum guide. The days blurred together in a rhythm of meetings, interviews, and tours, the sense of purpose invigorating him in a way he hadn't experienced since his active duty days. A week later, with Khalid's assessment team due to arrive in just 7 days, Harrington received an unexpected visitor while conducting a tour for a group of ROTC cadets. "As you can see," he was explaining, gesturing to the Abrams tank that dominated the central exhibition space, "the evolution of American tank design reflects a consistent philosophy, balancing firepower, protection, and mobility to create a weapon system that can dominate the battlefield through superior technology and crew training." The cadets, fresh-faced young men and women at the beginning of their military journeys, listened attentively, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions. Harrington saw in them echoes of his own youth, the mixture of idealism and uncertainty that characterized those on the threshold of military service. As the tour concluded and the cadets dispersed to explore the exhibits on their own, Harrington noticed a solitary figure standing near the entrance to the hall. Lieutenant Colonel Khalid, in civilian clothes again, observing the interaction with an inscrutable expression. Harrington approached him, professional courtesy masking his surprise at the unannounced visit. "Lieutenant Colonel, I wasn't expecting to see you until next week with your assessment team." Khalid nodded, his posture military precise, even in casual attire. "I decided to make another preliminary visit, unofficial this time. I wanted to observe the museum in its natural state, so to speak, without the formality of an assessment coloring the experience." There was something different about the younger officer today, a slight relaxation of his official demeanor, a hint of personal interest beneath the professional facade. "You're welcome anytime," Harrington said. "Would you like a personal tour? There are aspects of the collection that aren't covered in the standard presentation." Khalid hesitated, then nodded. I'd appreciate that, Mr. Harrington, if you have the time. For the next 2 hours, Harrington guided Khalid through the museum's collections, moving beyond the main exhibition spaces into the restoration workshops, the archive rooms, and the educational facilities. He showed him rare artifacts, explained the painstaking work of preserving and restoring historic vehicles, and demonstrated the interactive programs used with school groups. Throughout the tour, Khalid asked insightful questions, revealing a deeper knowledge of armored warfare history than his academic credentials had suggested. He seemed particularly interested in the Desert Storm exhibits, studying the photographs and equipment displays with focused attention. Your Abrams, he said, pausing before a display of personal items donated by Desert Storm veterans. Which unit was it attached to during the ground offensive? 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, Harrington replied. We were part of the Zevon Corps, tasked with engaging the Republican Guard divisions. Khalid nodded, his expression thoughtful. Including the Medina Division. Yes, Harrington confirmed, watching the younger man carefully. Our encounter with them was brief but intense. They fought well, despite being outmatched technologically. My father rarely spoke of the battle itself, Khalid said, his voice quieter now, more personal. Only that the American tanks appeared like ghosts through the sandstorm, firing with uncanny accuracy beyond the range of his own guns. He described it as fighting shadows that could see in the dark. It was the opening that Harrington had been waiting for, a glimpse of the man behind the Pentagon official. Your father survived the war, made it to the United States. That couldn't have been an easy transition. Khalid's gaze remained on the exhibit, but his thoughts seemed far away. He was one of the lucky ones. Captured, rather than killed, treated well as a prisoner of war, eventually granted asylum due to his opposition to Saddam's regime. But yes, starting over in a country he had fought against, raising a son in that environment, it was challenging. Yet you chose to serve in the U.S. military, Harrington observed. That must have been a complex decision. For the first time, Khalid smiled, a brief expression that transformed his serious countenance. My father encouraged it, actually. He said if I wanted to understand America, truly understand it, I should serve it. He had developed a deep respect for the American military, for its professionalism and, surprisingly, its humanity. Humanity isn't a word commonly associated with warfare, Harrington said carefully. No, Khalid agreed. But my father insisted that it was the moments of humanity amid the chaos of battle that revealed the true character of a fighting force. He spoke of an American officer, a tank commander, who risked his own safety to provide medical aid to Iraqi wounded, including my father. He never knew the man's name, but he credited him with saving his life, not just through medical assistance, but by treating him with dignity when he was at his most vulnerable. The revelation hung between them, charged with significance that Khalid couldn't possibly comprehend. Harrington felt a tightness in his chest, the weight of a secret 3 decades in the keeping pressing against his professional demeanor. Your father sounds like a man of honor, he said finally. Khalid nodded, turning away from the exhibit to face Harrington directly. He was, and he would have appreciated what you're doing here, Mr. Harrington, preserving not just the machines of war, but the human stories behind them. The comment, delivered with apparent sincerity, caught Harrington off guard. Does that mean you're reconsidering the budget cuts to the museum? Khalid's expression became guarded once more, the bureaucrat replacing the son. My personal feelings are irrelevant to the assessment process, Mr. Harrington. The Pentagon's budget constraints are real, and difficult choices must be made based on objective criteria. Objective criteria, Harrington repeated, unable to keep a hint of frustration from his voice. Can a spreadsheet measure the impact of a veteran finding healing by reconnecting with the vehicles they served on? Can it quantify the value of a child understanding the sacrifices made by previous generations? Some things defy measurement, Lieutenant Colonel. Perhaps, Khalid conceded. But those who control the purse strings require metrics, data points, cost-benefit analyses. Your passion for this institution is evident and admirable. Now you need to translate that passion into terms the Pentagon can process. The conversation had circled back to its beginning. The brief personal connection submerged once more beneath official positions and budgetary realities. Harrington recognized the shift and adjusted it accordingly. Then we'll provide those metrics, he said with renewed determination. By the time your assessment team arrives next week, we'll have comprehensive data on visitor engagement, educational impact, community integration, and historical significance. will speak the Pentagon's language while demonstrating the intangible value this museum provides. Khalid nodded approvingly. That's the approach most likely to succeed. I look forward to reviewing your presentation. As they concluded the tour and prepared to part ways, Khalid paused, seeming to wrestle with something unsaid. Finally, he spoke, his tone more personal than it had been since their discussion of his father. Mr. Harrington, may I ask you a question of a more personal nature? Of course. You served in Desert Storm, commanded in Abrams in combat against Iraqi forces, including potentially my father's unit. Yet you've dedicated your retirement years to preserving this history, to ensuring that both sides of the conflict are represented with accuracy and respect. How do you reconcile your role in the war with your current mission? It was a profound question, one that cut to the heart of Harrington's post-military life. He considered his answer carefully, aware that it might influence Khalid's perception of the museum's value. In war, he began, soldiers on both sides are serving their nations, following orders, fighting for their comrades. The political decisions that put them in conflict are beyond their control. What matters is how they conduct themselves within those circumstances, the choices they make when confronted with the enemy's humanity. He paused, the echo of the translated note resonating in his mind. Your father understood that, I think, and it's what this museum tries to convey, beneath the technical specifications and tactical analyses. The human dimension of warfare, the courage and sacrifice on all sides, the moments of compassion amid the violence. That's the history worth preserving, Lieutenant Colonel. Khalid's expression was unreadable, but he nodded slowly. Thank you for your candor, Mr. Harrington, and for the tour. It's been most illuminating. After Khalid's departure, Harrington returned to his office, his mind racing with new possibilities. The connection with Khalid's father had been confirmed beyond doubt, and the younger officer had revealed a personal perspective that might influence his assessment, despite his protestations about objectivity. But the fundamental challenge remained, convincing the Pentagon that the Patton Museum's value transcended the cold calculations of budget analysts. The Old Steel Brigade convened that evening in the museum's education center, which had been transformed into their campaign headquarters. Maps, charts, and strategy boards covered the walls, while tables were laden with laptops, documents, and coffee cups, the modern tools of their bureaucratic battle. Khalid was here again, Harrington announced as they assembled. Unofficial visit, he said, wanted to observe the museum in its natural state. Reconnaissance before the main assault, Thompson suggested, military metaphors never far from their conversation. Did you tell him about the note, about his father? Gonzalez asked directly. Harrington shook his head. Not yet, but we discussed his father's experience as an Iraqi officer captured during Desert Storm. Khalid knows that his father was aided by an American tank commander, though he doesn't know it was me. So what's our play here? Johnson inquired. Do we use this connection or keep it in reserve? It was the question Harrington had been pondering since Khalid's departure. The personal connection represented a potential advantage, a way to humanize the museum's mission in the eyes of a key decision-maker. But it also carried risks, both ethical and practical. For now, we proceed with the campaign as planned, he decided. We focus on building the strongest possible case based on the metrics Khalid mentioned, the data points and cost-benefit analyses that the Pentagon requires. If necessary, if all other approaches fail, then I'll reveal the connection. The others nodded in agreement, though Thompson looked troubled. Jim, have you considered that Khalid might already know, that this whole situation might be more complex than it appears? The question had occurred to Harrington as well, a nagging suspicion that there might be layers to Khalid's involvement that weren't immediately obvious. But without evidence, such speculations were unhelpful. Let's work with what we know, he advised. We have 1 week until the assessment team arrives. Let's make sure they see a museum that's not just historically significant, but vital to the Army's future. A resource that trains and inspires the next generation of soldiers. The following days were a blur of activity as the campaign reached its crescendo. Veterans groups organized a rally on the museum grounds, drawing hundreds of supporters from across the region. Local businesses pledged financial support, offering to sponsor exhibits and educational programs. The mayor and city council passed a resolution emphasizing the museum's economic impact on the community. National media picked up the story, framing it as a battle between budget-minded Pentagon officials and passionate veterans fighting to preserve military heritage. Harrington worked tirelessly, giving interviews, coordinating volunteer efforts, and refining the presentation for the assessment team. The Old Steel Brigade became a constant presence at the museum, each bringing their specialized skills to bear on the campaign. Thompson organized the veterans, Gonzalez coordinated with educational institutions, Chen managed the media relations, and Johnson handled the logistics of it all. Through it all, Harrington felt a growing sense of purpose, a clarity of mission that he hadn't experienced since his active duty days. The campaign to save the museum had become more than a bureaucratic battle, more than an effort to preserve a building and its contents. It had become a fight to ensure that the lessons of the past, both heroic and tragic, would continue to inform and guide future generations. The night before the assessment team's arrival, Harrington stayed late at the museum, walking alone through the quiet exhibition halls after the last visitors had departed. The tanks and armored vehicles stood in silent ranks, their metal surfaces gleaming dully in the low light. Each represented countless stories, the experiences of the men and women who had built them, operated them, maintained them, and in some cases died in them. He paused before the Abrams tank that occupied the central position in the Desert Storm exhibit, not his own vehicle, but one of the same model and configuration. In the stillness, he could almost hear the sounds of battle, the roar of the turbine engine, the metallic clang of the loader slamming around into the breach, the terse commands and acknowledgments over the intercom. "They're more than just machines, aren't they?" The voice startled him from his reverie. Turning, he found Dr. Chen standing a few paces away, her expression thoughtful as she regarded the massive tank. "Much more," Harrington agreed. "They're extensions of the crews that operated them, physical manifestations of national will and technological prowess, symbols of both destruction and protection." Chen moved to stand beside him, both of them now facing the Abrams. "When I first took this position, I saw them primarily as artifacts. Interesting from a historical and technological perspective, but ultimately just metal and machinery. It was veterans like you who taught me to see the human dimension, the stories embedded in every dent and scratch." Harrington nodded, appreciating her understanding. "Tomorrow will determine whether those stories continue to be told here in this place, or whether they're packed away in crates and forgotten." "You've done everything possible to prevent that," Chen assured him. "The presentation is compelling, the community's support is overwhelming, and the media attention has been beyond our expectations. If the Pentagon still decides to cut our funding after all this, it won't be because we didn't make our case." "And yet," Harrington said quietly, "it might not be enough. Budgets are powerful motivators in Washington, often more powerful than principles or public opinion." Chen studied him for a moment before speaking again. "You haven't told Lieutenant Colonel Khalid about your connection to his father." It wasn't a question, but Harrington answered anyway. "No, it felt like using a personal tragedy as leverage, manipulating an emotional response rather than making our case on the merits. But if the assessment goes against us tomorrow, I may have no choice." Would it be manipulation, Chen wondered? Or would it simply be completing a circle that began 30 years ago, allowing Khalid to understand the full context of his father's experience and your own? It was a perspective Harrington hadn't fully considered, framing the revelation not as a tactical move in their campaign, but as the resolution of a long-delayed personal matter. Perhaps there was a middle ground, a way to honor both the strategic needs of the museum and the ethical considerations of the personal connection. "Thank you, Eleanor," he said sincerely. "You've given me something to think about. Now you should go home and rest. Tomorrow will be demanding for all of us." After Chen had departed, Harrington remained in the quiet museum for a while longer, his decision gradually crystallizing. By the time he left, locking the doors behind him and walking to his car beneath a sky brilliant with stars, he knew how he would approach the assessment the next day, how he would balance the competing demands of strategy and integrity. The assessment team arrived precisely at 9 the following morning, a group of 5 Pentagon officials led by Lieutenant Colonel Khalid. They were met in the museum's main entrance by Harrington, Chen, and representatives of the local community, including the mayor and Chamber of Commerce president. Khalid made the introductions, his manner formal and professional. "Mr. Harrington, Dr. Chen, these are the members of our assessment team. Major Williams from the Budget Office, Captain Reynolds from the Museum Division, Dr. Patel from Historical Review, and Lieutenant Rodriguez from Facilities Management. We'll be conducting a comprehensive evaluation of the museum's operations, collections, educational programs, and financial status over the next 3 days." The formality of the introduction set the tone for what followed, a meticulous examination of every aspect of the museum's functions. The team split up, each member focusing on their area of expertise, interviewing staff, reviewing documents, inspecting facilities, and observing visitor interactions. Harrington had anticipated this approach and had prepared accordingly. Each team member was paired with a member of the museum staff or a volunteer who could provide detailed information and answer questions specific to their area of focus. The Old Steel Brigade was present but unobtrusive, available to offer the veterans' perspective when appropriate, but careful not to appear confrontational or defensive. By mid-afternoon, the assessment team reconvened in the museum's conference room for a formal presentation by Harrington and Chen. The room was packed with community leaders, veterans, educators, and media representatives, all there to demonstrate support for the museum and witness the proceedings. Chen opened with an overview of the museum's history and mission, followed by a detailed analysis of visitor demographics, educational outreach statistics, and community integration metrics. She presented the data clearly and compellingly, addressing the very criteria Khalid had mentioned during his previous visit. Then it was Harrington's turn. He stood at the podium, surveying the assembled officials, supporters, and media representatives. This was the moment toward which all their efforts had been building, the culmination of the campaign to save the museum. He felt a familiar calm settle over him, the clarity of purpose that had always characterized his most critical moments, whether in combat or in peace. Lieutenant Colonel Khalid, members of the assessment team, distinguished guests, he began, his voice steady and authoritative. You've heard the statistics, seen the facilities, reviewed the documents. All of that is important. All of it should factor into your assessment. But numbers and metrics can only tell part of the story. He gestured to the veterans seated throughout the room. These men and women represent generations of American military service, from World War II to the present day. They come from different branches, different eras, different backgrounds, but they share a common understanding of what this museum represents, not just as a collection of artifacts, but as a living connection between past and future. Harrington moved from behind the podium, preferring to stand directly before the assessment team, nothing between them but air and intent. A young soldier today, training on the most advanced equipment, facing complex modern threats, still needs to understand where we came from, how tactics and technology evolved, what lessons were learned through blood and sacrifice. This museum provides that understanding, not as an abstraction, but as a tangible, visceral experience. He paused, making eye contact with Khalid, whose expression remained impassive but attentive. Lieutenant Colonel, you mentioned during your preliminary visit that the Pentagon requires metrics, data points, cost-benefit analyses. We've provided those today, and they make a compelling case for the museum's value. But I would suggest that the most important metrics are the ones that can't be easily quantified. The veteran who finds healing by reconnecting with the vehicles they served on. The child who understands for the first time the sacrifices made by previous generations. The current service member who gains insight into the tactical problems their predecessors faced and solved. Harrington turned to include the entire room in his address, his voice gaining intensity without increasing in volume, a commander's skill honed through decades of leadership. This museum exists at the intersection of past, present, and future. It honors those who served, educates those who are serving, and inspires those who will serve. It preserves not just the machines of war, but the human stories behind them, the courage, innovation, and sacrifice that have characterized American armored warfare from its inception to the present day. He returned his focus to Khalid and the assessment team, his expression solemn. In making your determination about this institution's future, I ask you to consider not just what it costs to maintain, but what it would cost to lose. Not in dollars, but in knowledge, in connection, in understanding. Some institutions are worth preserving not because they're profitable or efficient, but because they're necessary, because they serve a purpose that transcends budget cycles and fiscal years. The room was utterly silent as Harrington concluded, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Then gradually, applause began, starting with the veterans and spreading until the entire assembly was on its feet, a spontaneous demonstration of support that continued for several minutes. When the applause finally subsided, Khalid stood, his expression still carefully neutral. Thank you, Mr. Harrington, for that passionate presentation. The assessment team will now deliberate privately. We'll reconvene tomorrow morning to present our preliminary findings and recommendations. As the crowd dispersed and the assessment team gathered their materials, Khalid approached Harrington privately. That was quite a speech, he said, his tone hard to read. You clearly believe deeply in this institution's mission. I do, Harrington confirmed. As I believe you do, despite your professional obligations to consider budgetary constraints. Khalid raised an eyebrow, a flicker of surprise crossing his features. What makes you say that? Harrington met his gaze steadily. Your questions during your visits, the way you engage with the exhibits, particularly those related to Desert Storm. This isn't just an assignment for you. It's personal in some way, perhaps because of your father's experience. A guarded expression settled over Khalid's face. My personal feelings are irrelevant to this assessment process, Mr. Harrington. We'll be evaluating the museum based on the criteria established by the Pentagon, not on emotional responses or individual preferences. Of course, Harrington acknowledged, but I would like to speak with you privately before you finalize your recommendations. There's something you should know, something that might provide additional context for your deliberations. Khalid hesitated, clearly weighing the propriety of such a meeting against his curiosity. I can spare a few minutes this evening, after the team has completed its initial discussions. Meet me in the main exhibition hall at 8. Harrington nodded, gratitude and apprehension mingling in his response. Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel. I'll be there. The hours until the meeting passed with excruciating slowness. Harrington briefed the Old Steel Brigade on the day's events, thanking them for their support and preparing them for the possibility that despite their best efforts, the assessment might not go in their favor. You've all served with honor, he told them, in combat and in this campaign. Whatever happens tomorrow, know that you've demonstrated once again the qualities that make our military exceptional: adaptability, dedication, and unwavering commitment to the mission. As 8 o'clock approached, Harrington made his way to the main exhibition hall, carrying with him the envelope containing the Iraqi officer's note and badge. The museum was closed to the public, the vast space eerily quiet without the usual flow of visitors. The tanks and armored vehicles stood in silent witness, their hulking forms casting long shadows in the reduced evening lighting. Khalid arrived precisely on time, still in his service uniform but with a slightly more relaxed bearing, the formality of the day's proceedings behind him. He found Harrington standing beside the Abrams tank in the center of the Desert Storm exhibit. Mr. Harrington, he greeted him, you said there was something I should know before our team finalizes its recommendations. Harrington nodded, the weight of the moment settling around him like a familiar cloak. Lieutenant Colonel, what I'm about to share with you is personal, not professional. It involves your father, myself, and a moment during Desert Storm that connected us in ways neither of us could have anticipated. Khalid's expression sharpened, his attention fully engaged. My father, you knew him? Briefly, Harrington confirmed. On February 26, 1991, during what would later be called the Battle of 73 Easting, my tank platoon engaged a Republican Guard unit, destroying 14 Iraqi tanks without loss. After the main engagement, I observed an Iraqi officer trying to extract wounded comrades from a disabled T-72. Against orders, I approached and provided medical assistance. Understanding began to dawn in Khalid's eyes, a recognition that transformed his features. You were the American tank commander, he said slowly, the one who showed mercy when none was expected, the one who saved my father's life. Harrington nodded, reaching into his pocket for the envelope. Your father gave me these before the extraction team arrived. A note and his unit badge. For 30 years, they've been among my most valued possessions, though I never knew what the note said until last week. He handed the envelope to Khalid, who accepted it with hands that trembled slightly, the professional veneer giving way to genuine emotion. You had these all this time, and you didn't know we were connected until I arrived to assess the museum? I suspected when I saw your badge during your first visit, Harrington explained. It matched the one your father gave me. The translation of the note confirmed it beyond doubt. Khalid carefully opened the envelope, examining the tarnished badge with reverence before unfolding the yellowed paper. Though he could read the Arabic text directly, Dr. Mahmoud's translation was included on a separate sheet, allowing him to confirm the accuracy of the interpretation. As he read, his expression cycled through surprise, grief, and a profound, quiet understanding. When he looked up, his eyes held a new depth, a personal connection that transcended their professional relationship. My father never told me the details of his capture, he said quietly, only that an American officer had treated him with dignity when he was at his most vulnerable. He credited that moment with changing his perspective on the United States, leading eventually to his decision to emigrate. But he never knew the officer's name, never had the opportunity to express his gratitude directly. It wasn't necessary, Harrington assured him. In that moment, we weren't American and Iraqi. We were just two soldiers caught in circumstances beyond our control, recognizing each other's humanity amid the chaos of war. Khalid carefully refolded the note, his movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. Why reveal this now, Mr. Harrington? Why not when we first met or during your formal presentation today? It was the critical question, the one that would determine how Khalid interpreted the revelation and what impact it might have on his assessment. Harrington had considered his answer carefully, knowing that complete honesty was the only approach that honored both the moment and the man before him. Because I didn't want it to influence your professional judgment, he said simply. The museum should stand or fall based on its merits, not on a personal connection between us. But before you finalized your recommendation, I felt you deserved to know the full context, to understand why this place and its mission matter so deeply to me and to others who have served. Khalid studied him for a long moment, as if seeing him truly for the first time. My father would have respected that decision, he said finally. He always emphasized the importance of separating personal feelings from professional obligations, a lesson I've tried to apply throughout my military career. He glanced down at the note and badge still in his hands. May I keep these? They represent a connection to my father that I never expected to find. Harrington nodded without hesitation. Of course. They've served their purpose in my keeping. They belong with you now, with his son. A silence fell between them, not uncomfortable, but charged with the weight of shared history, of connections that transcended the immediate circumstances of their meeting. Thank you for sharing this with me, Mr. Harrington, Khalid said finally. It doesn't change the fiscal realities the Pentagon faces, or the criteria by which this museum will be evaluated. But it does provide a powerful illustration of why institutions like this matter, why the human dimension of warfare must be preserved alongside the technical specifications and tactical analyses. It wasn't a promise or a commitment, but it was an acknowledgement, a recognition of the museum's deeper purpose. For now, it was enough. That's all I can ask, Lieutenant Colonel, Harrington replied, that you see beyond the spreadsheets and budgets to the real value of what we're preserving here. As they parted ways, Harrington felt a sense of completion, of a circle closing after 3 decades. Whatever the assessment team decided the following day, he had fulfilled an obligation long in the making, connecting a son with a father's legacy in a way that transcended the boundaries of nation, time, and circumstance. The next morning, the museum's conference room was filled to capacity once more as the assessment team prepared to deliver their preliminary findings. The atmosphere was tense, expectant, as Khalid took his position at the podium, flanked by the other members of his team. Harrington sat in the front row, flanked by Chen and the Old Steel Brigade, their expressions solemn but determined. Khalid surveyed the room, his gaze lingering briefly on Harrington before addressing the assembled crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience and cooperation during our assessment process. Over the past 2 days, we have conducted a comprehensive evaluation of the Patton Museum's operations, collections, educational programs, and financial status. We have reviewed statistical data, conducted interviews, observed visitor interactions, and examined the physical facilities. He paused, the room utterly silent, hanging on his next words. Based on our findings, we will be making the following recommendations to the Pentagon's Budget Office and the Department of Defense Museum Division. In that moment, as Khalid prepared to announce the fate of the institution to which Harrington had dedicated his retirement years, the former tank commander felt a familiar clarity descend upon him. Whatever the outcome, he had fought honorably, had given everything to the mission, had preserved a connection that might otherwise have been lost to the fog of war and the passage of time. In that, there was a victory that transcended the immediate battle over budgets and facilities. Khalid looked directly at Harrington as he continued, his expression unreadable but his voice steady and clear. Our assessment has led us to conclude that the Patton Museum represents a unique and valuable resource, not only for preserving military heritage, but for preparing current and future generations of soldiers for the challenges they will face. The human dimension of warfare, the connection between past, present, and future that Mr. Harrington so eloquently described yesterday, cannot be replicated through digital archives or dispersed collections. A murmur of hope rippled through the audience as Khalid continued. Therefore, we will be recommending that the Pentagon reconsider its proposed budget cuts to this institution, exploring instead alternative funding models that maintain the museum's core functions while addressing fiscal constraints. Specifically, we suggest a public-private partnership that leverages the considerable community support evident during our assessment, combined with targeted reductions in non-essential expenditures. The room erupted in applause, the tension of weeks breaking in a wave of relief and celebration. Harrington remained seated, a complex mixture of emotions washing over him. Beside him, Thompson clapped him on the shoulder, his weathered face split by a wide grin. Chen was already on her feet, preparing to address practical next steps. When the noise subsided enough for Khalid to continue, his tone was cautionary but not discouraging. This is a preliminary recommendation only. The final decision rests with the Pentagon's senior leadership. There will be challenges ahead, difficult decisions to make about resource allocation and operational priorities. But our team believes that with proper management and community engagement, the Patton Museum can continue to fulfill its vital mission while addressing the fiscal realities of the Department of Defense. As the formal proceedings concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Khalid made his way to where Harrington sat, still processing the unexpected turn of events. "Mr. Harrington," he said, extending his hand, "I want to assure you that our recommendation was based solely on the objective merits of the museum, not on any personal considerations." Harrington stood to shake the offered hand, recognizing the importance of the statement to Khalid's professional integrity. "I never doubted that, Lieutenant Colonel. But perhaps the personal connection helped you see those objective merits more clearly, just as it has for so many visitors over the years." Khalid nodded, a small smile breaking through his official demeanor. "Perhaps. My father would have approved of this outcome, I think. He always said that understanding the past was essential to navigating the future, especially in matters of war and peace." "A wise man," Harrington agreed. "You should be proud of his legacy, as I'm sure he would be proud of yours." As Khalid moved away to consult with his team members, Thompson stepped to Harrington's side. "So," the old medic said with characteristic bluntness, "your Iraqi officer's son just saved our museum. That's quite a full circle, Jim." Harrington watched Khalid across the room, seeing in him echoes of the dignified officer who had stood amid the burning wreckage of battle 30 years before. "Not my Iraqi officer, Doc. Just a man caught in the same machinery of war as the rest of us, trying to maintain his humanity in impossible circumstances. And yes, it is quite a circle." In the days that followed, as the assessment team's recommendation made its way through the Pentagon's bureaucratic channels and the museum staff began planning for a new operational model, Harrington found himself reflecting on the strange currents of fate that had brought him to this moment. From a battlefield in Iraq to a museum in Kentucky, from a young tank commander to an elderly veteran, from enemies facing each other across gun sites to allies working toward a common purpose. The lessons of that journey, he realized, were precisely what the museum existed to preserve and transmit: the complexity of the warfare, the humanity that persisted even in the most dehumanizing circumstances, the connections that could form across the artificial boundaries of nation and conflict. In saving the museum, they had affirmed its very reason for existing, had demonstrated in real time the value of understanding the human dimension of military history. As he stood once more beside the Abrams tank that had been the centerpiece of his presentation, Harrington felt a sense of peace settle over him, a completion that had eluded him since his return from Desert Storm. The circle had indeed closed, not just for him and Khalid, but for all those whose lives had been touched by the machinery of war and who sought to extract meaning from the experience. In that moment, James Thunder Harrington understood that the true legacy of his military service lay not in the battles won or the medals earned, but in the moments of humanity preserved amid the chaos, the connections formed across the divides of nation and time, and the wisdom passed from one generation of warriors to the next. It was a legacy worth fighting for, worth preserving, worth celebrating in halls like this one, where the past remained alive and relevant to the challenges of the present and the possibilities of the future. 6 months had passed since the Pentagon assessment team's recommendation to save the Patton Museum. Spring had yielded to summer, and summer was now giving way to fall, the Kentucky landscape transforming in a blaze of red and gold. James Harrington stood at the window of his new office, watching as a school bus disgorged a stream of excited children onto the museum grounds. The sight brought a smile to his weathered face, a reminder of why the battle had been worth fighting. The months since Khalid's assessment had been filled with intensive work as the museum transitioned to a new operational model. The public-private partnership recommended by the assessment team had taken shape, with local businesses, veterans organizations, and educational institutions joining forces to supplement the reduced Pentagon funding. New exhibits had been developed, educational programs expanded, and community outreach intensified. Throughout the transition, Harrington had remained at the center of the effort, his military experience providing a steady hand during the turbulent period of change. Dr. Chen had elevated him to the position of Director of Veteran Outreach, a role that formalized what he had been doing informally for years. The Old Steel Brigade had transitioned from a crisis response team to a permanent advisory council, bringing their varied experiences to bear on the museum's evolution. A knock at the door interrupted Harrington's contemplation of the autumn scene. Chen entered, carrying a manila folder and wearing the slightly harried expression that had become her norm during the reorganization. "James, do you have a moment? The proposal for the new interactive exhibit just arrived from the design firm. I'd like your input before we proceed." He turned from the window, gesturing to the chairs arranged around a small conference table in the corner of his office. "Of course, how's it looking?" Chen spread the documents across the table as they sat, revealing detailed schematics for a sophisticated simulation system that would allow visitors to experience various aspects of tank warfare in a controlled, educational setting. "Impressive," Harrington commented, studying the plans. "This goes beyond anything we've attempted before." "It's ambitious," Chen agreed, but the focus groups responded enthusiastically to the concept, especially the younger visitors who expect more interactive experiences than static displays can provide. Harrington nodded, recognizing the necessity of evolution. The museum couldn't remain frozen in time if it hoped to connect with new generations. Yet there was a balance to be maintained, ensuring that technological enhancements served the core mission rather than overshadowing it. "What about the veteran consultants? Have they reviewed the historical accuracy of the scenarios?" "That's actually why I wanted your input," Chen explained. "We need someone with direct combat experience to ensure the simulations are realistic without being traumatic, educational without being exploitative. The Old Steel Brigade seems like the perfect group to advise on that balance." The request resonated with Harrington. Since the successful campaign to save the museum, he had been searching for ways to keep the veterans engaged, to continue harnessing their expertise and passion. This project offered an ideal opportunity. "I'll convene the brigade next week," he decided. "We'll review the proposal in detail and provide recommendations for historical accuracy and appropriate content." As they concluded their discussion and Chen gathered the documents, she hesitated, a question clearly on her mind. "Have you heard from Lieutenant Colonel Khalid since the final approval came through from the Pentagon?" Harrington shook his head. "Not directly. I received a formal letter from his office confirming the new funding arrangement, but nothing personal. I imagine he needs to maintain professional distance, given his role in the assessment process." Chen nodded, accepting the explanation but clearly finding it somewhat unsatisfying. "It just seemed like there was more to the story between you two, something beyond the official relationship." "There was," Harrington acknowledged, "and perhaps there will be again someday. But for now, the professional boundaries need to be respected. Khalid did his job with integrity, balancing personal connections with official responsibilities. I respect him for that." After Chen departed, Harrington returned to the window, his thoughts turning once more to the strange interconnection of lives that had brought him to this point. The Iraqi officer in the desert, the son who had grown to serve in the same military that had once fought against his father, the museum that now stood as a testament to the human dimensions of warfare that transcended national boundaries and political conflicts. The following week, the Old Steel Brigade assembled in the museum's education center, now transformed into a more permanent meeting space for the advisory council. Thompson, Gonzalez, Chen, and Johnson had all arrived early, their commitment to the museum's mission undiminished by the successful conclusion of the immediate crisis. They were joined by several newer members, veterans from more recent conflicts who brought fresh perspectives to the group's deliberations. Harrington laid out the plans for the interactive exhibit explaining the technical specifications and educational objectives. The veterans studied the proposal with professional interest, their questions incisive and informed by direct experience. The scenarios need to be historically accurate but not graphically violent, Thompson observed. We want visitors to understand the realities of armored warfare without traumatizing younger guests or triggering combat veterans. And we need to ensure multiple perspectives are represented, Gonzalez added, not just American but allied forces and even adversaries. Understanding the capabilities and limitations of opposing forces is crucial to appreciating the tactical challenges our crews faced. The discussion continued, the veterans building upon each other's insights, refining the concept until it balanced educational value with appropriate content. Harrington guided the conversation with a light touch, recognizing that these men and women didn't need a commander so much as a facilitator, someone to channel their collective wisdom toward a common objective. As the meeting concluded and the veterans began to disperse, Thompson lingered behind, a habit he had developed during their campaign to save the museum. The old medic had become something of a confidant to Harrington, their shared experiences in combat creating a bond that required few words to maintain. "You seem restless, Jim," Thompson observed once they were alone, his tone casual but his eyes sharp with perception. "The museum's secure, the new programs are taking shape, the old steel brigade is engaged. By any measure, we've accomplished the mission, yet you don't have the look of a man enjoying victory." Harrington smiled wryly, unsurprised by his friend's insight. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who's known you as long as I have," Thompson replied. "So what's eating at you? Unfinished business with our Pentagon friend?" The question struck closer to the mark than Harrington might have expected. In the months since Khalid's assessment, he had found his thoughts returning frequently to the lieutenant colonel and the unusual connection between them. The son of the Iraqi officer he had encountered in the desert 3 decades earlier, now a key figure in preserving the very history that had shaped both their lives. "Perhaps," he admitted, "the coincidence of our meeting, the revelation about his father, the way it all came together to save the museum. It feels incomplete somehow, like the final chapter hasn't been written." Thompson nodded, understanding. "Military careers teach us to expect closure, to complete the mission and move on to the next objective. But life rarely provides such neat conclusions, especially when it involves personal connections rather than tactical objectives." Harrington considered the observation, recognizing its truth. His military service had instilled in him an expectation of defined outcomes, missions either accomplished or failed. The ambiguous conclusion of his interaction with Khalid, professionally successful but personally unresolved, left a loose end that his military mindset struggled to accept. "What would constitute closure for you, Jim?" Thompson asked. "A personal acknowledgement from Khalid? A continued relationship beyond the professional interaction? Or something else entirely?" It was a profound question, one that forced Harrington to examine his own expectations. What did he hope would emerge from the connection with Khalid? Was it simply the satisfaction of knowing that his act of compassion in the desert had rippled forward through time, influencing not just the Iraqi officer's life, but his son's as well? Or was there something more, some deeper resolution he sought? "I'm not sure," he admitted finally. "Maybe it's enough to know that the circle closed, that the museum was saved partly because of a moment of humanity amid the chaos of war. Maybe that's the only resolution we can expect in this imperfect world." Thompson didn't press the issue further, respecting Harrington's need to process these questions in his own time. Instead, he changed the subject to more immediate concerns, the upcoming Veterans Day ceremony that the museum was planning, and the role the Old Steel Brigade would play in the event. The conversation shifted to practical matters, but Harrington's thoughts continued to circle back to Khalid and the unresolved nature of their connection. Perhaps Thompson was right, and life seldom offered the neat conclusions that military operations demanded. Perhaps he needed to accept the ambiguity, to find satisfaction in knowing that the museum had been saved, even if the personal dimension remained somewhat incomplete. As October yielded to November, preparations for the Veterans Day ceremony intensified. The event had taken on added significance in light of the museum's near closure and subsequent revival, transforming from a routine observance into a celebration of resilience and renewal. Veterans from across the country had confirmed their attendance, drawn by media coverage of the museum's successful campaign against Pentagon budget cuts. Harrington found himself increasingly engaged in the planning process, working closely with Chen and the museum staff to create a program that honored those who had served while highlighting the museum's evolving mission. The ceremony would feature the unveiling of several new exhibits, including the interactive simulation system that the Old Steel Brigade had helped refine. 3 days before the ceremony, as Harrington was reviewing the final schedule in his office, Chen appeared at his door, an expression of barely contained excitement on her face. "James, you have a visitor, someone I think you'll want to see immediately." Before Harrington could inquire further, a familiar figure appeared behind Chen in the doorway. Lieutenant Colonel Adam Khalid, in civilian clothes rather than his service uniform, stood with the straight-backed posture of a career military officer. "Mr. Harrington," Khalid said formally, "I hope I'm not interrupting anything urgent." Harrington rose from his desk, surprise giving way to genuine pleasure at the unexpected visit. "Lieutenant Colonel, this is a welcome interruption. Please come in." Chen withdrew discreetly, closing the door behind her as Khalid entered the office. The younger officer's demeanor was more relaxed than during his previous visits. The official assessment, now months in the past, and its successful outcomes secured. "I was in the area for a conference at Fort Knox," Khalid explained, "and thought I should see how the museum is progressing under the new operational model. Unofficially, of course." "Of course," Harrington agreed, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "We're making significant strides. The public-private partnership is functioning well. Visitor numbers are up 30%, and we're expanding our educational programs with several new initiatives." Khalid nodded approvingly. "The Pentagon is pleased with the results. Your museum is being cited as a model for other military heritage sites facing similar budget constraints. A successful adaptation to fiscal realities while preserving the core mission." It was a positive assessment, yet delivered with a formality that suggested Khalid's visit might have additional purposes beyond a routine follow-up. Harrington waited, sensing that the lieutenant colonel was working towards something more personal than professional updates. "But that's not why you're here, is it?" he prompted gently when the silence extended. Khalid's composed expression softened slightly. "No, it's not. I've been reflecting on our last conversation, on the revelation about my father and your role in his capture. It's taken some time to process that information, to understand its implications for both my personal history and my professional assessments." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew an envelope, placing it carefully on the desk between them. "I found this among my father's personal effects, which I inherited after his death. At the time, its significance wasn't clear to me. Now it is." Harrington opened the envelope with careful movements, mindful of the age of the document inside. It was a photograph, creased and faded, showing a younger Kareem al-Rashid standing beside a teenage boy who could only be Adam Khalid. They were posed in front of what appeared to be an American tank, possibly at a museum or military display. "That was taken at the Patton Museum," Khalid explained, watching Harrington's reaction closely. "When I was 16 years old, my father brought me here, insisted that I needed to understand American military history if I was to understand my new country. At the time, I thought it was strange, perhaps even disloyal to our Iraqi heritage, to visit a place that celebrated the machinery that had defeated our former nation." Harrington studied the photograph, recognizing in the older al-Rashid's expression a quiet dignity, a man who had found peace with his past and was trying to pass that understanding to his son. "Your father was a wise man," he said, handing the photograph back to Khalid. "He understood that understanding military history isn't about celebrating victory or mourning defeat. It's about learning from the past to create a better future." Khalid nodded, carefully returning the photograph to its envelope. "He said something similar that day. He told me that the machines of war were important to study, but that the human decisions behind them were what truly mattered. The choices made by leaders, by commanders, by individual soldiers in moments of crisis." The observation resonated with Harrington, echoing his own philosophy about the museum's purpose. "Your father understood the essence of what we're trying to preserve here, not just the tanks and armored vehicles, but the human dimension of warfare, the stories of courage, sacrifice, and yes, sometimes mercy, that give meaning to the technical specifications and tactical analyses." "He never told me about you specifically," Khalid continued. "Never named the American officer who had shown him compassion in the desert. But he spoke often of that moment, of how it had changed his perspective on the United States, shown him that even enemies could recognize each other's humanity. It was one of the factors that led to his decision to emigrate after the war, to build a new life in the nation that had defeated his own. Harrington absorbed this information, finding in it a partial answer to the questions that had lingered since Khalid's departure after the assessment. His act of compassion toward a wounded enemy officer had rippled through time, influencing not just al-Rashid's life, but his son's as well, helping to shape the man who now sat across from him. When I was assigned to assess this museum, Khalid went on, I had no idea of the connection that would emerge. The coincidence seems almost impossible, statistically speaking. Yet here we are, linked by a moment that occurred before I was old enough to remember, in a desert half a world away. Life rarely follows statistical probabilities, Harrington observed, especially in matters of human connection. Sometimes paths cross in ways that defy explanation, but seem somehow right, as if guided by a purpose beyond our understanding. Khalid smiled slightly, the professional reserve giving way to a more personal warmth. My father would have appreciated that perspective. He developed a deep respect for American pragmatism during his years here, but he never lost his belief in a larger design to human events. The conversation paused as both men considered the strange confluence of circumstances that had brought them together, first as assessment officer and museum representative, then as two individuals connected by a shared history neither had initially recognized. I'm sorry I couldn't acknowledge our connection more directly during the assessment process, Khalid said finally. Professional ethics required that I maintain objectivity, that I base my recommendations solely on the merits of the museum rather than personal considerations. You did exactly what you should have done, Harrington assured him. Your integrity in that situation reflects well on both your military service and your father's influence. The museum's value should stand on its own merits, not on personal connections or emotional appeals. Khalid nodded, accepting the affirmation with quiet dignity. The assessment team's recommendation was indeed based on objective criteria. The museum's historical significance, educational impact, and community integration all justified its continued operation, even in a modified form. But I can't deny that our conversation that night, your revelation about my father, provided a powerful illustration of why institutions like this matter, why preserving the human dimension of warfare is essential to understanding its full context. The acknowledgement offered a measure of closure, a confirmation that while the personal connection hadn't determined the professional outcome, it had provided a meaningful frame for understanding the museum's deeper purpose. It was, Harrington realized, as much resolution as he could reasonably expect, perhaps more than he had any right to hope for. Will you be attending our Veterans Day ceremony? He asked, shifting the conversation toward the future rather than the past. We're unveiling several new exhibits, including an interactive simulation system that your assessment team might find interesting as a model for other military museums. Khalid appeared to consider the invitation carefully before responding. Unfortunately, my conference concludes tomorrow, and I have commitments in Washington that can't be rescheduled. But perhaps another visit can be arranged in the future, a more comprehensive evaluation of how the museum is adapting to its new operational model. It was a professional response, maintaining appropriate boundaries while suggesting the possibility of continued connection. Harrington accepted it as such, recognizing that their relationship would likely always exist at the intersection of personal history and professional roles, neither dimension fully separate from the other. As their meeting concluded and Harrington walked Khalid to the museum entrance, they passed through the main exhibition hall where preparations for the Veterans Day ceremony were underway. Staff members were arranging chairs, positioning podiums, and adjusting lighting for the upcoming event. At the center of it all stood the Abrams tank that had been the focal point of Harrington's presentation to the assessment team, now surrounded by new interactive displays that would be unveiled during the ceremony. Khalid paused before the massive vehicle, his expression thoughtful. My father once told me that he couldn't hate the machines that had defeated his unit, only respect their technological superiority and the skill of those who operated them. He said that true warriors understood the capabilities of both their own weapons and those of their adversaries, without emotion clouding their assessment. A soldier's perspective, Harrington agreed. The machinery matters, but it's the human element that ultimately determines the outcome. The decisions made in moments of crisis, the training that becomes instinct under fire, the bonds between crew members that turn four individuals into a single fighting unit. They stood in silence for a moment, Two military men from different generations and backgrounds, united by their understanding of warfare's realities and the importance of preserving its lessons for future generations. Safe travels, Lieutenant Colonel, Harrington said as they reached the museum entrance. And thank you for taking the time to visit, both professionally and personally. It means a great deal to know that your father found a new life here, that his son serves with honor in the same military that once stood against him. There's a profound message in that evolution, a testament to the possibility of reconciliation and renewal even after conflict. Khalid extended his hand, his grip firm and respectful. Thank you, Mr. Harrington, for your service, both in uniform and here at the museum. And for that moment in the desert, though neither of us could have imagined its long-term implications. My father would be pleased to know that the connection has come full circle. As Khalid departed, Harrington remained at the entrance for a moment, watching the younger officer walk to his car with the straight-back posture that marked military men of all nations and eras. The visit had provided a measure of closure, a confirmation that the strange connection between them had meaning beyond coincidence, that the act of compassion in the desert 3 decades earlier had rippled forward through time in ways neither participant could have anticipated. The Veterans Day ceremony exceeded all expectations, drawing a record crowd to the museum grounds on a crisp November morning. Veterans from World War II through the recent Middle East conflicts gathered to honor those who had served, to reconnect with the machines they had operated, and to share their stories with younger generations. Local dignitaries, Pentagon representatives, and media outlets added to the occasion's significance, highlighting the museum's successful transition and renewed mission. Harrington, as the museum's director of veteran outreach, played a central role in the proceedings, introducing speakers, unveiling news exhibits, and sharing his vision for the institution's future. The Old Steel Brigade was prominently featured, each member contributing their unique perspective on the importance of preserving military history in tangible, accessible forms. The interactive simulation system, refined with input from the veteran advisors, proved particularly popular with visitors, especially younger guests who responded enthusiastically to the hands-on experience. The system balanced technological engagement with historical accuracy, allowing participants to understand the challenges faced by tank crews without glorifying the violence of combat. As the formal ceremony concluded and visitors dispersed throughout the museum grounds, Harrington found a quiet moment to stand alone beside the Abrams tank that had been the centerpiece of their campaign. The massive vehicle gleamed under the exhibition lights, a testament to American engineering and the skill of the crews who had operated it in combat. "Quite a day," Thompson commented, appearing at Harrington's side with the quiet movement that belied his age. From nearly closing to becoming a model for military museums nationwide, not bad for a bunch of old tank jockeys. Harrington smiled, appreciating his friend's characteristically understated assessment. The Old Steel Brigade delivered as always, adapted to changing conditions, overcame obstacles, accomplished the mission. And our Pentagon friend? I noticed he wasn't among the official delegation today. He visited earlier this week, Harrington explained. Unofficial capacity. We had a chance to discuss the connection with his father, to bring some closure to that unexpected development. Thompson nodded, understanding the significance without requiring details. Circle's closing, important at our age, Jim. We've seen enough unfinished business, enough stories without endings. It's good to complete the narrative when we can. The observation resonated with Harrington, capturing what he had felt after Khalid's visit. Not a neat military conclusion, with objectives clearly accomplished and forces withdrawing in good order, but a human resolution, messy and incomplete in some ways, but satisfying in its recognition of connections that transcended the immediate circumstances. "I've been thinking about something Khalid said," Harrington shared as they walked slowly through the exhibition hall, past displays that chronicled the evolution of American armored warfare from its earliest iterations to the present day. About how his father brought him to this very museum as a teenager, trying to help him understand his new country through its military history. An Iraqi officer who had fought against American forces, bringing his son to study the machines that had defeated his own unit. The human element, Thompson said simply. Beyond the technology, beyond the tactics, beyond the politics. That's what we're really preserving here, isn't it? Not just the tanks and armored vehicles, but the stories of the people who built them, operated them, faced them in combat, and sometimes found moments of connection across enemy lines. It was an insight that crystallized Harrington's thinking about the museum's purpose and his own role within it. Beyond the technical specifications and tactical analyses, beyond the chrome and steel of the exhibition pieces, lay the human dimensions of warfare: courage, fear, camaraderie, sacrifice, and sometimes unexpected compassion. "That's exactly it, Doc," he agreed, using Thompson's old combat nickname. "And that's what we need to emphasize moving forward. The machinery matters, the technological evolution is important to document, but it's the human stories that give meaning to the metal, that help visitors understand not just what happened, but why it matters." They continued their circuit of the exhibition hall, pausing occasionally to observe visitors engaging with the displays, veterans sharing stories with rapt listeners, children asking questions about the massive vehicles that dominated the space. In each interaction, Harrington saw the museum fulfilling its deeper purpose, connecting past and present through the tangible remnants of military history and the intangible stories they represented. As the day drew to a close and the last visitors departed, Harrington found himself once more at the window of his office, watching as the setting sun cast long shadows across the museum grounds. The Abrams tank from the Desert Storm exhibit was visible from his vantage point, a silhouette against the fading light that triggered memories of similar dusk scenes in the Iraqi desert 3 decades earlier. The connection with Khalid and his father had brought those memories into sharper focus, not as fading recollections of a distant conflict, but as living threads that connected past and present, enemy and ally, destruction and renewal. In that connection, Harrington had found a deeper understanding of his own military service and its long-term implications, both for himself and for others whose lives had intersected with his during those brief, intense moments of combat. He had gone to war as a young officer, committed to his mission and his men, focused on the immediate objectives of defeating enemy forces and protecting his own troops. He had returned with a more complex understanding of warfare's realities, of the human beings caught in its machinery on both sides of the conflict. And now, in his latter years, he had discovered that actions taken amid the chaos of battle could ripple forward through time in ways impossible to predict, touching lives across generations and national boundaries. It was this understanding that he hoped to convey through the museum's exhibits and programs, this recognition of warfare's complexity and the humanity that persisted even in its darkest moments. Not to glorify combat or celebrate victory, but to ensure that those who had never experienced war's realities might still learn from its lessons, might recognize both the necessity of military preparedness and the profound cost of failing to find peaceful resolutions to international disputes. A knock at his door interrupted these reflections. Chen entered, carrying a small package wrapped in plain brown paper. "This just arrived for you by courier," she explained, placing the package on his desk. The delivery service said it was urgent. After Chen departed, Harrington examined the package with curiosity. It bore no return address, only his name and the museum's location written in a precise hand. Cautiously, he unwrapped the brown paper to reveal a small wooden box, finely crafted with a hinged lid. Inside, nestled in protective velvet, lay a military medal that he recognized immediately as an American Bronze Star. Accompanying the medal was a handwritten note on Pentagon letterhead. "Mr. Harrington," the note began in Khalid's distinctive handwriting. "After our recent conversation, I took the liberty of reviewing your service record from Desert Storm. I discovered that a commendation for your actions in aiding wounded Iraqi personnel, including my father, was filed by your commanding officer but never processed due to the rapid conclusion of hostilities and subsequent administrative oversight. I have taken steps to rectify this omission. The enclosed Bronze Star with V device for valor was approved by the Secretary of the Army last week, in recognition of your courage in placing humanitarian considerations above strict adherence to orders during combat operations. While medals cannot capture the full significance of such actions, especially those that ripple forward through time, affecting lives in unforeseen ways, they serve as tangible reminders of moments when our better nature prevails amid the chaos of conflict." With respect and gratitude, Lieutenant Colonel Adam Khalid, Harrington sat motionless, the medal and note before him representing a conclusion he had never sought or expected. The Bronze Star was among the highest decorations awarded for valor in combat, typically reserved for actions that directly contributed to mission success or saved American lives. Its award for aiding enemy wounded was unusual, a recognition that military honor sometimes transcended the immediate objectives of combat operations. Yet it wasn't the medal itself that moved him most deeply, but the recognition it represented, the acknowledgement that an act of compassion toward a wounded enemy had meaning beyond the moment, had contributed in some small way to a larger narrative of reconciliation and understanding. In Khalid's efforts to secure this recognition, Harrington saw the completion of a circle that had begun in the desert 3 decades earlier, a confirmation that even amid warfare's destruction, human connections could form that transcended national boundaries and political conflicts. Carefully, he returned the medal to its box and placed it on a shelf beside the other mementos of his military service. Unlike those other decorations, awarded for tactical success or leadership under fire, this one represented something more personal, more profound, a moment when humanity had prevailed over the dehumanizing pressures of combat. In the days and weeks that followed, Harrington found himself approaching his work at the museum with renewed purpose and clarity. The successful Veterans Day ceremony had demonstrated the institution's continued relevance, while his interaction with Khalid had crystallized his understanding of its deeper mission. Beyond preserving the machines of war, the museum existed to tell the human stories behind them, to ensure that future generations understood both the necessity of military preparedness and the profound cost of failing to find peaceful resolutions to international disputes. Under his guidance, the Old Steel Brigade expanded its advisory role, developing new programs that emphasize the personal experiences of veterans from various conflicts. Oral history initiatives captured the memories of aging veterans before they were lost to time. Educational outreach programs brought students into contact with those who had served, creating connections across generations that gave meaning to the abstract concepts of duty, sacrifice, and honor. The interactive simulation system, refined based on veteran input, became a model for military museums nationwide, demonstrating how technology could enhance rather than replace the human dimension of historical presentation. Visitors engaged not just with the technical aspects of armored warfare, but with the decisions faced by commanders and crews, the moral complexities of combat operations, the moments when humanity asserted itself amid the machinery of destruction. Throughout these developments, Harrington maintained periodic correspondence with Khalid, their initial connection evolving into a professional relationship based on mutual respect and shared understanding of military history's importance. The lieutenant colonel's position within the Pentagon's museum division allowed him to advocate for the Patton Museum's approach, suggesting similar adaptations for other military heritage sites facing budget constraints. As winter settled over the Kentucky landscape, transforming the museum grounds with a blanket of pristine snow, Harrington found himself increasingly at peace with the strange journey that had brought him to this point. From young tank commander in the desert to elderly museum director, from warrior to educator, from participant in history to its preserver and interpreter, his life had followed a path he could never have anticipated, but that now seemed somehow right, as if guided by a purpose beyond his understanding. On a cold December morning, as he conducted a tour for a group of veterans from a local retirement community, Harrington paused beside the Abrams tank in the Desert Storm exhibit. The visitors, men and women who had served in Vietnam, Korea, and even a few from World War II, listened attentively as he explained the vehicle's capabilities and the experiences of its crew during combat operations. But the most important aspect of this tank, or any weapon of war, he concluded, isn't its technical specifications or tactical applications. It's the human element, the decisions made by commanders and crews in moments of crisis, the bonds formed between soldiers facing combat together, and sometimes the recognition of shared humanity even across enemy lines. As the veterans nodded in understanding, their own experiences resonating with his words, Harrington felt the full circle of his life's journey complete. In preserving the machines of war, he had found a way to honor the human stories behind them. In recounting the battles of the past, he had discovered a means of promoting understanding that might, in some small way, contribute to a more peaceful future. And in that realization, James Thunder Harrington, once a warrior of steel and now its historian, found a satisfaction deeper than any tactical victory, a purpose that transcended the immediate objectives of combat operations, a legacy that would endure in the lives touched by his example, both on the battlefield and beyond. The tanks stood silent in their ordered ranks, metal sentinels preserving the lessons of the past for generations yet to come. Around them moved the visitors, veterans and civilians, young and old, each finding in these machines of war something unique and personal, a connection to history, a recognition of sacrifice, an understanding of the complex interplay between technology and humanity that defined modern warfare. And in their midst walked Harrington, no longer commanding tanks in combat, but guiding others through the history they represented, sharing the wisdom gained through decades of service, both in uniform and beyond. His battle now was against forgetting, against the loss of hard-won knowledge and perspective that each generation must rediscover if it is to avoid the mistakes of the past. It was a different kind of service, quieter perhaps than the thunder of guns and the roar of engines that had defined his military career, but no less essential to the nation he had sworn to protect. For in preserving the artifacts of war, he helped ensure that its lessons remained accessible to those who had never experienced its realities, that its costs were understood by those who might someday decide whether to commit American forces to combat once more. As the tour concluded and the veterans dispersed throughout the museum, one elderly man lingered behind, approaching Harrington with the measured movements of advanced age, but the unmistakable bearing of a former soldier. "That was quite a presentation, Colonel," he said, using Harrington's former rank as veterans often did among themselves. "You made those machines come alive, made us understand what it was like to operate them in combat." "Thank you," Harrington replied, noting the Korea veteran's cap the man wore. "But I'm sure you understand that perspective better than most, having served yourself." The old soldier nodded, his eyes distant with memory. Different war, different machines, but some things remain constant. The fear, the camaraderie, the moments when everything comes down to split-second decisions in the training you hope will see you through. He gestured toward the Desert Storm exhibit, where the Abrams tank stood, surrounded by displays detailing the conflict's background and outcome. "You mentioned recognizing humanity across enemy lines. That resonated with me. I had a similar experience in Korea, a moment that stayed with me for 70 years now." Harrington listened as the veteran recounted an encounter with a Chinese soldier during the bitter fighting near the Chosin Reservoir, a brief moment of connection amid the frozen hell of combat. It wasn't a dramatic tale of rescue or mercy, just a fleeting recognition between two young men caught in circumstances beyond their control, a shared cigarette during a temporary ceasefire, a few words exchanged through rudimentary sign language before they returned to their respective units in the business of trying to kill each other. "Never knew what happened to him," the old soldier concluded. "Probably died somewhere on that frozen battlefield, like so many others. But I've never forgotten his face, or that moment when we weren't enemies, just two cold, scared kids a long way from home." Harrington nodded, understanding perfectly. "Those are the moments that define us, I think, not the battles won or the medals earned, but the times when we see beyond the uniforms and flags to the human beings on both sides of the conflict." The veteran studied him with the knowing gaze of one who has witnessed humanity at its worst and its best. "You've had such a moment yourself, haven't you? I could hear it in the way you spoke, see it in your eyes when you talked about recognizing the enemy's humanity." "I have," Harrington acknowledged. "Desert Storm, 1991. An Iraqi officer wounded trying to save his men from a burning tank. I broke protocol to provide medical aid. Decades later, I met his son, an American officer now, carrying forward his father's legacy in ways neither of us could have imagined during that moment in the desert." The old soldier smiled, an expression of profound understanding. "Circles closing, important at our age, isn't it? To know that some of what we did mattered beyond the immediate objectives, that some good came from all that destruction and loss." It was an echo of Thompson's words after the Veterans Day ceremony, a recognition that resonated across generations of veterans, this need to find meaning amid the chaos of war, to believe that individual acts of decency and compassion might somehow balance the ledger against the necessary violence of combat operations. "Very important," Harrington agreed. "And that's what we're trying to preserve here, along with the tanks and artifacts. Those human stories, those moments of connection and decency that remind us what we're fighting for, and sometimes what we're fighting against." As the elderly veteran moved on to explore the rest of the museum, Harrington remained by the Desert Storm exhibit, contemplating the strange journey that had brought him to this point. From the burning sands of Iraq to the snow-covered grounds of the Patton Museum, from young tank commander to elderly historian, from participant in history to its preserver and interpreter, his life had followed a path he could never have anticipated. Yet standing there among the silent machines of war, surrounded by the evidence of humanity's capacity for both destruction and compassion, James Thunder Harrington felt a profound sense of rightness, of purpose fulfilled, of a circle completed. In saving the museum, he had helped ensure that the lessons of the past would continue to inform the present and shape the future. In sharing his experiences, he had transformed personal memory into collective understanding. And in recognizing the humanity of an enemy officer 3 decades earlier, he had set in motion a sequence of events that transcended national boundaries and generational divisions, creating connections that defied the destructive logic of warfare. It was, he realized, the most meaningful victory of his long career, not measured in territory gained or enemy combatants neutralized, but in lives touched, perspectives broadened, understanding deepened. A victory not of steel against steel, but of humanity asserting itself amid the machinery of destruction, of compassion prevailing over the dehumanizing pressures of combat, of individual decency standing firm against the tide of organized violence. And in that victory, quiet but profound, James Thunder Harrington found a peace that had eluded him since his return from Desert Storm, a completion that gave meaning to all that had come before and purpose to all that lay ahead, a legacy that would endure in the lives touched by his example, both on the battlefield and beyond.